To German officers, war production meant slave labor, secret factories, and militarized industry. In America, it meant housewives, high school students, and farm boys clocking in after work. To the men seated in Berlin's oak-paneled war rooms, war was something that belonged exclusively to the state. It was a realm of uniformed soldiers, rigid hierarchies, and industries stripped of individuality and bent entirely toward destruction. In Nazi Germany, the state commanded the economy as it commanded its armies. Every factory was a fortress, every worker a cog in a militarized machine. The very idea that civilians, acting voluntarily and without coercion, could shoulder the burden of total war was considered laughable. Yet by 1944, intelligence reports from their own spies were bringing news that seemed almost fantastical. The United States, a nation that barely had an army 5 years earlier, was now producing more aircraft in a single year than Germany had managed in the entire decade since Hitler's rise to power. Entire fleets of bombers and fighters were being built, not by soldiers or slaves, but by ordinary people, men and women who had never set foot on a battlefield. For the German leadership, this was more than a statistic. It was a sign that they had fundamentally misread their enemy. They had underestimated the industrial power of the United States, yes, but more importantly, they had misunderstood the latent strength of a democracy once it decided to fight. In the 1930s, Nazi planners had looked across the Atlantic with a mix of contempt and curiosity. America was wealthy, certainly, blessed with abundant natural resources, a vast population, and the world's largest consumer economy. But it was, in their eyes, a nation too soft and too disorganized to wage a modern war. Hitler mocked the United States as a mongrel nation, too divided by ethnicity and too consumed by materialism to fight with discipline. Hermann Göring, who built the Luftwaffe, believed the U.S. could never marshal its chaotic industries into a single coordinated war effort. These assumptions shaped Germany's entire strategic outlook. Nazi analysts concluded that America's economy was too focused on producing consumer goods, too fragmented by private ownership, and too dependent on unmilitarized civilian labor. Its democratic system, with its endless debates and compromises, would prevent swift decision-making. And its people, scarred by the Great War and deeply isolationist, would never accept the sacrifices necessary for a global conflict. Even if the United States entered the war, they reasoned, it would take at least 5 to 10 years to build a war machine capable of challenging Germany's. By then, the Third Reich would have secured its dominance. The reality would prove them catastrophically wrong. The very qualities they dismissed, America's consumer economy, its free labor force, its decentralized industrial base, would become its most potent weapons. Once mobilized, the United States would convert its civilian industries with breathtaking speed. Factories that once made cars now produced tanks. Refrigerator plants built aircraft engines. Typewriter companies turned out machine guns. Within 2 years of entering the war, America had reshaped its economy into a war machine of unprecedented scale and flexibility. Even Britain, its closest ally, was stunned by the speed of this transformation. The turning point came in December 1940 when President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in a radio address to the nation, declared that the United States must become the arsenal of democracy. It was more than a slogan. It was a call to arms for every man, woman, and business in the country. And Americans responded. By 1943, over 17 million new workers had joined the industrial workforce. Most of them had never set foot in a factory before. They were housewives and teachers, farmhands and high school students, retirees and shopkeepers. And yet, within months, they were operating complex machinery, welding steel, assembling tank engines, and riveting bomber fuselages. This was not a war effort driven by soldiers. It was driven by ordinary people. Across the country, entire families joined the fight without ever leaving their hometowns. College students in California spent their summers building aircraft components. Farmers in the Midwest worked long days in the fields before heading to night shifts at tank plants. Auto workers in Detroit, who once competed to build the fastest cars, now competed to build the most Sherman tanks. These civilians weren't just helping, they were mastering advanced industrial skills once reserved for trained craftsmen. They were doing precision machining, advanced welding, and complex assembly. As historian Arthur Herman would later write, the American worker was as essential to victory as any soldier on the front. What set this workforce apart was not just its size, but its motivation. These were not coerced laborers working under the lash as they were in Nazi Germany. They were volunteers driven by patriotism and a shared belief that their labor was a weapon. They understood that every bomber they built, every tank they riveted, was a blow against tyranny. And they worked with a determination that no secret police could ever enforce. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than at Willow Run, the sprawling bomber plant built by the Ford Motor Company in Michigan. Designed from the ground up to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator, one of the Allies' most important heavy bombers, Willow Run was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was nearly a mile long and employed more than 40,000 workers, many of whom had never worked in aviation. At first, experts scoffed at Ford's ambition. Building a heavy bomber was far more complex than building a car. Each B-24 contained over 1.5 million parts and required thousands of precise steps. Many believed that mass-producing them was impossible, but Ford applied the same principles that had revolutionized the automobile industry. It streamlined production, standardized components, and optimized workflows. The results were staggering. At its peak, Willow Run was rolling a completed B-24 off the assembly line every 63 minutes. German intelligence analysts were stunned. Their own aircraft factories relied on highly skilled labor and rigidly controlled production chains. The idea that thousands of untrained workers, housewives, teenagers, retirees, could assemble advanced aircraft on such a scale seemed absurd. And yet it was happening. In towns across America, this phenomenon repeated itself. After finishing their day jobs, people would carpool to local factories for second shifts, literally building warplanes in their spare time. The line between civilian and soldier had blurred. It was no longer just the men on the front lines who were fighting the war. It was the entire nation. The departure of millions of men into the armed forces might have crippled the workforce. Instead, it triggered another transformation that the Nazis had never anticipated. Women, who had long been relegated to domestic roles, stepped into industrial jobs on an unprecedented scale. By 1944, they made up more than one-third of the workforce. They welded fuselages, machined engine components, riveted bomber wings, and supervised assembly lines. They became electricians, mechanics, and factory foremen. They didn't just replace the men, they often outperformed them. The most famous symbol of this revolution was Rosie the Riveter, a fictional character who came to represent the strength and determination of these women. But Rosie was not a myth. She was millions of real people who had traded aprons for overalls and kitchens for factory floors. In Nazi Germany, women were expected to bear children and serve the state indirectly. The idea that they could build bombers or assemble tank engines was unthinkable. Yet in America, women were building the very machines that would bomb German cities and defeat the Wehrmacht. Over 300,000 aircraft were built during the war, most of them by a workforce dominated not by professional engineers or soldiers, but by civilians, and many of them were women. Captured German officers held in American POW camps were often bewildered when they saw female mechanics repairing vehicles or female guards patrolling the camp. How could a society so casual, so egalitarian be capable of such industrial might? It was a question they would never fully answer. As the war dragged on and demands for weapons grew ever greater, the American war effort transformed from a government program into something far more profound, a national crusade. The line between civilian life and military necessity blurred almost completely. Towns across the United States began to function like miniature arsenals, their rhythms dictated not by seasons or markets, but by production schedules and supply quotas. It was no longer unusual to see factory whistles blowing at midnight, or entire neighborhoods emptying out at dawn as carpools carried workers to aircraft plants and shipyards. Schools rearranged schedules to allow older students to take part-time shifts on assembly lines. Churches organized volunteer drives to collect scrap metal and rubber, while unions coordinated around-the-clock operations to keep machines humming. Even children became part of the effort. Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts collected aluminum from old pots and pans, rubber from discarded tires, and scrap iron from barns and junkyards. These seemingly insignificant contributions added up to thousands of tons of raw material that would eventually find their way into airplanes, tanks, and warships. Housewives planted victory gardens so that more commercially grown food could be sent to troops overseas. Housewives also learned to weld, machine, and assemble parts. The ordinary rhythms of life, birthdays, weekends, social events, were all reshaped around a single, unifying purpose: victory. In places like Detroit, the so-called arsenal of democracy, bakers and butchers joined forces after hours to make aircraft instruments and radio components. In small towns across the Midwest, carpenters converted barns into workshops to produce wooden crates, munitions cases, and training gliders. America's war effort was not just happening in sprawling factories like Willow Run. It was unfolding in garages, basements, schools, and churches. The sheer scale of what the United States achieved through this communal mobilization defied imagination. In 1940, before the war began in earnest, the United States produced just over 6,000 aircraft. 4 years later, that number had skyrocketed to nearly 96,000. German intelligence analysts, who had once predicted that American production would be too slow to make an impact, were forced to admit their error. Germany's own aircraft production peaked at around 39,000 in 1944, less than half of America's output that year. By the time the war ended, the United States had produced over 300,000 aircraft, dwarfing Germany's total of roughly 120,000. And this staggering output extended beyond planes. American factories produced over 86,000 tanks, nearly 300,000 artillery pieces, and more than 2 million military trucks. It was a tidal wave of material so immense that German generals later confessed they had no answer for it. And yet, the numbers tell only part of the story. What truly shocked German officers was not just the volume of production, but the manner in which it was achieved. Nazi Germany's wartime economy was built on compulsion. Millions of slave laborers, men and women dragged from occupied countries, toiled under brutal conditions, often sabotaging their work or producing substandard goods. German factories were subject to constant Allied bombing, and their rigid, centrally controlled production system struggled to adapt. By contrast, the American model was decentralized and dynamic. Private companies competed to innovate and improve efficiency. Workers proposed new methods and were rewarded for boosting output. A sense of shared purpose infused every level of production. Even mistakes were quickly corrected because the people on the ground, not faceless bureaucrats, were empowered to solve problems. This difference was rooted in ideology. Nazi planners viewed civilians as passive consumers, incapable of contributing meaningfully to war unless coerced. In their worldview, war was the domain of the state. The concept of voluntary mass mobilization, of a free people willingly transforming their entire economy into a weapon, was beyond their comprehension. The American model, on the other hand, thrived on individual initiative and civic responsibility. Free enterprise, voluntary participation, and an almost religious belief in the righteousness of the cause created a system far more flexible and scalable than anything the Axis powers could build. A captured German officer, reflecting after the war, summed it up succinctly. We could not imagine a society where housewives built bombers and farmers built tanks. And yet, this is what defeated us. Every bomber, fighter, and tank that rolled out of an American factory carried a story within it. A story not of faceless workers, but of ordinary people whose lives had been transformed by the war effort. Some workers signed the inside panels of aircraft they helped build, leaving handwritten messages like, "Good luck, boys," or "Give 'em hell." These signatures were small, but powerful reminders that these machines were not products of a faceless war machine, but the handiwork of a nation united in purpose. A P-51 Mustang might carry the fingerprints of a farmer's daughter from Iowa on its wings, the rivets tightened by a former schoolteacher from Ohio, and the cockpit instruments assembled by a retired mechanic from Brooklyn. A B-17 Flying Fortress might be the work of hundreds of hands, none of them soldiers, but all of them warriors in their own right. This civilian participation had a psychological effect on Germany that went beyond mere logistics. It was demoralizing to realize that they were not just fighting armies, but entire populations, a mobilized society where every citizen was, in some sense, a combatant. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as decadent and weak, incapable of sacrifice. But here was proof that the opposite was true. A free and democratic society, far from being a liability, had become the most formidable weapon in the Allied arsenal. Every new factory that opened, every worker who joined a shift, every plane that rolled off an assembly line was a direct challenge to the Nazi worldview. By 1944, German generals were openly admitting what they had refused to believe just a few years earlier. They could not win an industrial war against the United States. Their own economy, hamstrung by ideology, slave labor, and resource shortages, was being overwhelmed by a nation that had turned its entire civilian population into an industrial army. Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich was being buried under an avalanche of tanks, planes, and munitions built by people who, only a few years earlier, had been selling groceries, teaching schoolchildren, or raising families. The story of America's wartime production is not just one of numbers and machines. It is a story of human will, of a society that, when threatened, refused to remain passive. It is a story of ordinary people rising to an extraordinary challenge, of a democracy proving that its greatest strength lay not in authoritarian control but in collective action. And it is a story of how those ordinary people, working in their spare time, built the machines that would crush tyranny and reshape the world. As 1944 turned to 1945, the full consequences of America's industrial miracle became impossible for the Nazi leadership to ignore. By this point, the skies over Europe were filled with waves of bombers that seemed endless, fleets of B-17s and B-24s stretching from horizon to horizon, escorted by nimble P-51 Mustangs whose long-range capabilities allowed them to follow the bombers deep into the heart of Germany. Factories, oil refineries, rail yards, and communication hubs were pounded relentlessly. It wasn't just the Luftwaffe that was being destroyed. It was the very industrial infrastructure Germany depended on to fight. And every time the Germans believed they had inflicted a crippling blow, more American aircraft arrived to replace the losses. They couldn't be built fast enough to stop them, nor shot down quickly enough to make a difference. The psychological toll was immense. German air defense planners were used to thinking in terms of scarcity. Every aircraft lost was a serious blow, every pilot irreplaceable. But to their astonishment, America treated war material as if it were disposable, a product to be manufactured, replaced, and improved. When hundreds of bombers were lost during dangerous raids over Berlin or Plesty, hundreds more arrived within weeks. Pilots were replaced just as quickly, trained by a system so efficient it felt like an assembly line itself. German generals began to speak of American production as a force of nature, inexorable, unstoppable, impossible to match. The confidence that had fueled Hitler's conquests in the early years of the war was replaced by a creeping sense of inevitability. They were fighting a war they could not possibly win. And still, the production expanded. While the European front consumed enormous resources, the United States simultaneously waged a war on the other side of the planet, across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. There, too, the fruits of civilian labor were decisive. Aircraft carriers, each a floating airbase built in American shipyards by thousands of ordinary hands, rolled off assembly lines at an astonishing pace. Destroyers, submarines, and supply ships followed in endless convoys. The same pattern repeated itself again and again. American losses were swiftly replaced, Japanese or German ones were not. The industrial imbalance was so vast that even when the Axis powers scored tactical victories, they found themselves strategically weaker than before. Every destroyed American bomber or sunken ship only deepened the lesson that had been haunting German officers since 1942. The United States was not fighting with soldiers alone, it was fighting with everyone. On the home front, the scale of sacrifice and adaptation was equally staggering. Civilians bought war bonds, rationed gasoline and meat, endured blackouts, and accepted government restrictions on consumer goods without protest. The automobile industry, once the pride of American consumer culture, built virtually no civilian cars between 1942 and 1945. Instead, Detroit's assembly lines produced tanks, trucks, aircraft engines, and munitions. Chevrolet built artillery shells, Packard manufactured aircraft engines, General Motors produced amphibious landing craft. The transformation of the U.S. economy was so complete that even industries with no connection to defense found ways to contribute. Cosmetics companies produced camouflage paint, typewriter manufacturers built machine guns. Toy companies made precision instruments for bomb sights and navigation systems. The effect on American society was profound. People who had once lived ordinary, quiet lives found themselves part of something much larger than themselves. A schoolteacher might now spend her evenings riveting bomber wings. A retiree might machine components for naval guns. A teenager might work a night shift wiring aircraft cockpits. These experiences forged a powerful sense of unity and shared purpose. It was no longer just the armed forces who were fighting the Axis. It was the entire nation, from the assembly line to the classroom to the family farm. And that sense of national mobilization created a resilience that authoritarian regimes, reliant on fear and compulsion, could never match. Meanwhile, in Germany, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Allied bombing campaigns had shattered transportation networks and disrupted supply lines. Synthetic fuel plants, vital to Germany's war effort, were destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Raw materials grew scarce. Skilled workers were conscripted into the military, leaving factories understaffed. Slave laborers, demoralized and often deliberately sabotaging their work, could not match the productivity of free, motivated workers across the Atlantic. As a result, German production stagnated just when it needed to accelerate. Even when Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, introduced sweeping reforms and centralized control over war industries, the results paled in comparison to what the United States achieved with a decentralized, volunteer-driven approach. The contrast was not lost on the Germans themselves. In post-war interviews, captured officers and officials spoke with a mixture of awe and despair about America's industrial system. They had believed, with near religious certainty, that authoritarian control was the key to total war. Instead, they had witnessed a democracy unleash a level of power they had never thought possible. The Allies' material superiority was not simply a matter of larger population or greater resources, though those certainly helped. It was the result of an economic and social system that encouraged initiative, rewarded innovation, and united a free people around a common goal. Germany had built a war machine. America had built a nation that was itself a weapon. By the spring of 1945, the results were undeniable. The skies over Germany were dominated by Allied aircraft. The seas were controlled by Allied fleets. On the ground, American tanks, many of them built by workers who had never seen a battlefield, rolled inexorably toward Berlin. Entire divisions were supplied, transported, and sustained by an industrial base so vast that logistical challenges that would have crippled other armies were solved with relative ease. Even in the final desperate months of the war, when Germany resorted to building jet fighters and wonder weapons, these technological marvels were too few, too late, and too fragile to change the outcome. Against the industrial might of the United States, a might built by millions of ordinary people, they were like pebbles thrown at a tidal wave. The lesson was clear to anyone who cared to see it. The United States had redefined what it meant to wage total war. It had proven that free societies could not only match authoritarian regimes in mobilization, but could surpass them in every meaningful way. It had shown that ordinary people, when united by a common cause, could achieve extraordinary things. And it had demonstrated that the true strength of a nation lies not only in its armies or its generals, but in its citizens, in their willingness to sacrifice, to work, and to believe that their efforts matter. For German officers who had once dismissed the United States as a nation of weak-willed consumers, the realization was bitter and humbling. They had underestimated the strength of democracy. They had failed to see that freedom, messy, chaotic, and uncoerced, could be more powerful than tyranny. And they had learned too late that a society where housewives built bombers and farmers built tanks was a society that no dictatorship could ever hope to defeat. The collapse of Nazi confidence did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a creeping shadow that grew, darker with every shipment of American war material that arrived on European shores. At first, German leaders convinced themselves that America's surge in production was unsustainable, a burst of energy from a nation not accustomed to total war, one that would soon burn itself out. They pointed to labor strikes, to racial tensions, to political debates in Congress, hoping these internal divisions would paralyze the American war machine. But none of it happened. Instead, America's output continued to climb month after month, year after year, in defiance of every expectation. The longer the war lasted, the stronger and more efficient the American system became. This resilience shook the ideological foundations of the Nazi worldview. The Third Reich had built its identity on the belief that liberal democracies were inherently weak, that free societies were too selfish, too disorganized, too soft to endure the rigors of a prolonged conflict. Nazi propaganda portrayed the United States as a decadent culture obsessed with jazz music, Hollywood films, and consumer comforts, a land incapable of sacrifice or discipline. Yet the reality unfolding on the ground could not have been more different. Americans were rationing meat and gasoline, planting victory gardens, saving scrap metal, and buying war bonds at unprecedented rates. They were accepting wage freezes, working 12-hour shifts, and paying higher taxes, all without the coercion of a police state. In many cases, they did these things not grudgingly, but proudly. It was a collective act of will that the Nazi leadership had never anticipated. This ideological shock extended even to the German people themselves. As Allied bombers reduced cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden to rubble, ordinary Germans began to question how their enemies, supposedly weak and decadent, could muster such overwhelming power. Rumors spread that the United States had limitless reserves of steel and oil, that it could build bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. The psychological impact of this belief was almost as damaging as the bombs themselves. German morale, once buoyed by swift victories and promises of a 1,000-year Reich, began to crumble under the weight of relentless American abundance. Inside the Nazi high command, the mood turned grim. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, privately admitted that the Reich could not match American production. He urged Hitler to negotiate peace before it was too late, warning that Germany's industrial base was no match for what he called America's bottomless reservoir of strength. Hitler, delusional and stubborn, refused. He clung to the hope that technological breakthroughs, jet fighters, ballistic missiles, even the rumored atomic bomb, could turn the tide. But technology could not compensate for a lack of resources, manpower, and industrial capacity. Every new weapon Germany built was dwarfed by the sheer quantity of American planes, tanks, and ships rolling off assembly lines. In the end, it was not a single weapon or battle that doomed the Reich. It was the realization that Germany was being crushed by an enemy it had once mocked as incapable of total war. Meanwhile, American production was not only overwhelming Germany, it was transforming the strategic landscape of the entire conflict. The Red Army's relentless push from the east, for instance, would have been impossible without the trucks, locomotives, and food supplied by American factories. Soviet offensives depended heavily on American-built Studebaker trucks for mobility, while American aircraft engines powered Soviet planes. Lend-Lease Aid, the program through which the U.S. supplied its allies with war material, became a vital artery of the Allied war effort. In total, the United States shipped over 400,000 trucks, 14,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of food, ammunition, and raw materials to the Soviet Union alone. These supplies did not win the war by themselves, but they ensured that the Allies could sustain the pressure on all fronts simultaneously. German generals reading reports of American vehicles on the Eastern Front and American tanks in Normandy could only marvel and despair at the scale of their opponent's reach. The ability to fight and supply multiple major campaigns at once was one of America's most significant advantages. Germany had fought its wars sequentially, concentrating first on Poland, then on France, then on the Soviet Union, because it lacked the resources to fight them all at once. The United States, by contrast, was launching massive amphibious invasions in North Africa, Italy, and France, while simultaneously conducting a naval and island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. It was supplying Britain with food and weapons, sustaining China's resistance against Japan, and fueling the Soviet war effort, all while maintaining a standard of living at home that, while reduced, was still far higher than anything in the Axis world. This global reach was only possible because of the vast, decentralized network of civilian workers and industries back home. Every ship launched, every bomber produced, every convoy assembled, was a testament to the power of a free society working toward a common purpose. And it wasn't just machines that America was producing. The war effort created a new kind of expertise, a fusion of civilian ingenuity and military necessity. Factories developed new materials and manufacturing techniques that would lay the foundation for post-war industries. Women gained skills and confidence that would fuel the push for gender equality in the decades ahead. African Americans, who had fought discrimination in both the workplace and the military, used their wartime contributions as leverage in the emerging civil rights movement. The war changed America fundamentally, socially, economically, and politically, and those changes would shape the world long after the guns fell silent. For Germany, however, these transformations were invisible behind the thick fog of ideology. Nazi leaders remained prisoners of their own worldview, unable to comprehend how a free society could mobilize so effectively without compulsion. They dismissed America's achievements as accidents of geography or resource abundance, failing to see the deeper truth: that a society built on freedom, diversity, and voluntary cooperation could, when threatened, harness a level of strength far greater than one built on fear and obedience. This misunderstanding was not just a tactical error, it was a fatal strategic flaw. By the time American troops crossed the Rhine and Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, the war was already lost. The Third Reich had been outthought, outfought, and above all, outproduced. German tanks like the Panther and Tiger were engineering marvels, powerful, deadly, and technically superior to many Allied designs. But they were expensive and slow to build, while American factories churned out thousands of reliable Shermans that overwhelmed the enemy through sheer numbers. The Luftwaffe's jet fighters were revolutionary, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers to make a difference. Even Germany's vaunted V-2 rockets, terrifying as they were, consumed vast resources while delivering little strategic benefit. Against a nation that could build planes, ships, and tanks faster than Germany could destroy them, these wonder weapons were ultimately futile. The war was proving a lesson that would resonate long after 1945. In modern conflict, industrial capacity is as decisive as military strategy. And America's capacity, driven not by militarism or tyranny, but by millions of ordinary citizens working together, had become the decisive factor in the greatest war the world had ever seen. By early 1945, the war that Adolf Hitler had once promised would make Germany master of Europe was instead turning into a desperate struggle for survival. The industrial machine that had fueled the Blitzkrieg in 1939 was now sputtering under relentless Allied pressure. Oil was running out. The rail network was in ruins. Cities that once housed factories now lay in smoldering heaps, their production lines reduced to rubble by thousands of American and British bombers. Even basic raw materials were in short supply. Steel mills lacked coal, aircraft plants lacked aluminum, tank factories lacked rubber and fuel. Where once the Third Reich had boasted of its capacity to fight a long war, now it could barely keep its armies supplied. And as Germany's production declined, America's seemed only to grow stronger. The United States was now producing so much that its problem was not scarcity, but abundance. By 1945, the U.S. Army and Navy had stockpiles of weapons and vehicles so vast that they sometimes exceeded immediate battlefield needs. Entire fleets of trucks, tanks, and aircraft were waiting in reserve, ready to replace losses before they even occurred. Allied generals could plan offensives with a confidence the German High Command could only dream of, knowing that behind every soldier and every tank stood an almost inexhaustible supply line stretching back across the Atlantic. In the Pacific, the same abundance enabled the United States to leapfrog from island to island, constructing massive bases and airfields as fast as engineers could pour concrete, each one supplied by a logistical network so vast that it resembled a moving city. For the Germans, this industrial imbalance created a sense of helplessness that no propaganda could conceal. It was not just that the Allies had more tanks, more planes, and more ships. It was the speed and scale at which they could replace them. Every time the Wehrmacht destroyed an American armored column, two more appeared within weeks. Every time the Luftwaffe shot down a bomber formation, an even larger one filled the sky the next month. The United States had achieved something far more significant than numerical superiority. It had built an industrial system that could sustain total war indefinitely. That realization, the knowledge that the Allies could simply outlast them, broke German morale long before Allied troops reached Berlin. Even Germany's vaunted technological innovations could not change the outcome. The V-2 rocket, the first ballistic missile in history, was a terrifying weapon, but it consumed vast amounts of resources for relatively little strategic return. Jet fighters like the Me-262 were faster and deadlier than anything the Allies had, but they were produced in such small numbers that they barely made a dent in the bomber streams darkening German skies. The Tiger and Panther tanks, engineering marvels that could outgun and outarmor most Allied tanks, were so expensive and complicated to build that they were hopelessly outnumbered by Shermans and Churchills. German generals knew the math by heart. For every Tiger that rolled off an assembly line, America produced dozens of Shermans. In a war of attrition, that kind of disparity was fatal. Meanwhile, America's factories continued to hum with relentless efficiency. In Detroit, production lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In California, shipyards launched new vessels so rapidly that workers joked they could build a destroyer faster than Germany could sink one. In Pennsylvania and Ohio, steel mills poured molten metal around the clock, forging the armor plates and artillery barrels that would shatter the Wehrmacht's defenses. It was not uncommon for a single American factory to outproduce an entire German industry sector. The numbers were so lopsided that even Albert Speer, a master organizer and one of the few Nazi officials respected by Allied planners, privately conceded that Germany's defeat was inevitable once America entered the war. On the battlefield, the results of this industrial dominance were unmistakable. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, the largest amphibious operation in history, was not just a triumph of strategy and courage. It was a triumph of logistics and manufacturing. The thousands of ships, landing craft, tanks, trucks, and aircraft that made the invasion possible were the product of millions of civilian hands working thousands of miles from the front. And once the beachhead was secured, it was America's industrial might that kept the advance moving. The famous Red Ball Express, a vast truck convoy system that supplied Allied forces in France, was possible only because American factories had produced so many vehicles that they could afford to dedicate tens of thousands solely to logistics. German generals marveled at the spectacle, not just the tanks and artillery that crushed their defenses, but the endless lines of fuel trucks, repair vehicles, and supply convoys that followed them. "They fight a mechanized war," one German officer reportedly remarked, "and they fight it as if they had infinite machines." As the Allies advanced deeper into Germany, the collapse of Nazi industry accelerated. Strategic bombing had left entire sectors of the economy in ruins. Rail lines were twisted wreckage, bridges lay in rivers, and fuel refineries were blackened shells. Even when German factories managed to produce weapons, they often couldn't transport them to the front. Tanks sat idle for lack of gasoline. Aircraft were grounded for want of spare parts. Ammunition shipments never arrived. The German war machine, once the envy of the world, was grinding to a halt. In April 1945, as Soviet troops closed in from the east and American forces pushed from the west, the once proud leaders of the Third Reich faced a reality they had spent years denying. They had been defeated not only on the battlefield but in the factories, the workshops, and the assembly lines. Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, raged against what he called America's soulless materialism, blaming the United States' industrial strength on its Jewish capitalist system. But his tirades fooled no one. The truth was simpler and more devastating. The Nazi regime had built a war machine that relied on control, coercion, and terror. America had built one that relied on freedom, innovation, and the voluntary efforts of millions of ordinary people. And that difference, more than any weapon or strategy, had decided the outcomes of the war. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, German officers and officials were forced to confront the scale of their miscalculation. Many were interrogated by Allied intelligence officers, and their statements reveal a mixture of astonishment, grudging respect, and bitter regret. They admitted they had never believed a democracy could mobilize so completely, nor that a civilian population could sustain such an intense industrial effort for so long. They had underestimated America's capacity to innovate, its willingness to sacrifice, and its ability to turn private enterprise into a war-winning machine. One captured general put it bluntly: "We were prepared to fight soldiers. We were not prepared to fight a nation." It was a lesson that would shape military and political thinking for decades to come. The Second World War demonstrated beyond any doubt that industrial capacity and the ability to harness an entire society's potential was as decisive as armies and navies. And in that realm, no nation had ever matched what the United States accomplished between 1941 and 1945. It was not just a triumph of steel and machinery. It was a triumph of spirit, of a free people who, when called upon, turned their factories, their homes, and their very lives into the greatest arsenal the world had ever seen. The guns finally went silent in Europe on May 8, 1945. Germany's once vaunted Reich had collapsed into ruin, its cities reduced to rubble, its armies shattered, its leadership dead or captured. The war that Hitler had believed would cement Germany's place as the dominant power in the world ended instead with unconditional surrender. In the aftermath, Allied soldiers marched through devastated towns and hollowed-out factories, past civilians who stared with hollow eyes at the occupying forces. The Nazi dream of a 1,000-year empire had lasted barely 12, and in the wake of that defeat, one truth stood above all others. Germany had not been destroyed solely by armies or bombs. It had been defeated by a nation that had turned its entire civilian population into an engine of war. For many German officers and officials, this realization was profoundly unsettling. During interrogations and post-war interviews, they spoke with astonishment about the scale of American production. They described the sense of disbelief they felt when they learned that the United States had built more planes in a single year than Germany had built in the entire war, or that one American shipyard could launch a new Liberty ship every few days. They were stunned to discover that American factories had produced not just enough equipment for their own forces, but enough to equip their allies as well. "We never understood how a nation that was not prepared for war could become so powerful so quickly," one captured officer admitted. "We thought we had time. We were wrong." The depth of this miscalculation went far beyond numbers. Nazi Germany's leaders had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their opponent. They believed that democracy was a weakness, that a society based on individual freedom could never match the discipline and focus of a totalitarian state. They assumed that a free market economy would be too chaotic and inefficient to sustain total war. They believed that a nation of consumers would never accept the sacrifices required to fight a global conflict. But America had proven them wrong on every count. Its democracy had mobilized faster and more effectively than any dictatorship. Its free market had outproduced every centrally planned economy. Its people, far from being weak, had accepted rationing, shortages, and backbreaking work without complaint. And it was precisely because America was a free society, because its people believed in the cause for which they fought, that they were willing to make those sacrifices. The scale of America's wartime production was staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced over 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, and 40 billion rounds of ammunition. They built more merchant ships than all other nations combined and more warships than Japan and Germany together. They supplied the food, fuel, and equipment that kept Allied armies marching across Europe and Asia. They provided the weapons that equipped the armies of Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and dozens of other nations. And they did it while maintaining a standard of living at home that, though reduced by wartime rationing, remained far higher than that of any Axis power. This was not just an industrial achievement, it was a societal one. It reflected the combined efforts of millions of individuals who, in ways large and small, contributed to the war effort. Housewives who collected scrap metal, farmers who increased food production, students who worked part-time in factories. All of them were part of the same vast machine. What made this feat even more remarkable was that it was accomplished without the brutal coercion that characterized Axis war economies. Germany had relied on forced labor, dragging millions of men and women from occupied territories into its factories and work camps. Japan had exploited colonial populations and prisoners of war. The Soviet Union, America's ally but ideological opposite, had mobilized its population through fear and compulsion. The United States did none of these things. Its workforce was voluntary. Its production was driven by incentives and patriotism, not by whips and threats. And yet it outproduced them all. The power of voluntary cooperation, of a society united by shared purpose, had proven more formidable than any system based on fear. The shock of this realization extended beyond Germany. Around the world, military strategists, political leaders, and economists studied America's wartime mobilization with a mixture of admiration and alarm. They understood that something fundamental had changed. The industrial capacity of a nation was now as important as the size of its armies or the brilliance of its generals. Wars would no longer be won solely on the battlefield. They would be won in factories, shipyards, and research laboratories. And in this new era, the United States had demonstrated a model that no one could ignore. A model in which the entire population, not just the military, became part of the war effort. This shift had profound implications for the post-war world. America emerged from the war not just victorious, but dominant. Its economy was larger than those of all its allies and former enemies combined. Its industrial base was intact and humming, while Europe and Asia lay in ruins. It possessed a navy that controlled the world's oceans, an air force that could reach any corner of the globe, and a nuclear monopoly that gave it unprecedented strategic power. But perhaps its greatest strength was its capacity to mobilize, the knowledge that if another conflict arose, the United States could once again transform itself into a global arsenal almost overnight. For Germany, the lesson was bitter but instructive. In the decades that followed, the country rebuilt itself as an industrial power, but this time as a democracy, one that embraced many of the principles it had once mocked. West Germany's post-war economic miracle, built on free markets, voluntary labor, and international cooperation, was in many ways a testament to the lessons learned from defeat. The authoritarian model that had promised efficiency and discipline had failed. The democratic model that had been dismissed as weak had triumphed. The cultural memory of America's wartime production also endured within the United States itself. The experience of total mobilization left a deep imprint on American society. It fostered a sense of national unity and shared purpose that would shape the country's politics and identity for generations. It laid the foundation for the Cold War military-industrial complex, which would ensure that the United States remained prepared for global conflict. And it reinforced a belief, sometimes exaggerated but deeply held, that there was nothing Americans could not accomplish when they worked together. For the men who had led Germany into war, none of this was apparent in 1939. They had believed they were fighting a conventional conflict, a struggle of armies and weapons, battles and strategies. They had not understood that they were fighting something far larger, a society that had transformed itself into a weapon a people who had turned their homes, factories, and daily lives into instruments of war. That misunderstanding sealed their fate. They had prepared to fight soldiers. They had not prepared to fight a nation. The story of America's wartime mobilization is, in the end, not just a story about industry or strategy. It is a story about people, ordinary people, who rose to an extraordinary challenge. It is about the housewives who built bombers, the farmers who built tanks, the students who wired aircraft, the retirees who machined gun barrels. It is about a society that refused to be passive, that refused to accept tyranny, and that proved that freedom, messy, imperfect, and chaotic as it may be, could be the most powerful weapon of all. And it is about the men on the other side of the war, the German officers who stared in disbelief as the arsenal of democracy swept away everything they had built, realizing too late that the world had changed forever. The world that emerged after 1945 was profoundly shaped by what had happened in America's factories, shipyards, and assembly lines during the war. The lesson was clear to every government and general on the planet. Modern warfare was no longer just a contest of armies and navies. It was a contest of societies. The nation that could mobilize its population, harness its economy, and sustain industrial production over the long term would almost always prevail. And no nation had proven this point more decisively than the United States. For the first time in history, a war had been won not merely by battlefield victories, but by the coordinated effort of millions of civilians far from the front lines. The housewives who riveted bombers, the farmers who grew surplus grain to feed armies, the machinists who built tank engines, the scientists who developed new materials and weapons, all of them had been as essential to victory as the soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy or fought in the forests of the Ardennes. This realization fundamentally changed how nations prepared for war in the decades to come. Military planners began to think not only about troop strength and firepower, but also about industrial capacity, supply chains, and workforce mobilization. Economists and politicians recognized that national security depended as much on the strength of a nation's factories as on the strength of its armies. New alliances like NATO were built not just around military commitments but also around the pooling of industrial resources. In many ways, the Cold War was as much an industrial and technological competition as it was a military one, and the United States entered that competition with an enormous advantage thanks to the lessons it had learned and the infrastructure it had built during World War II. At home, the legacy of the war effort reshaped American life in ways few had anticipated. The industries that had been created or expanded to produce weapons of war now turned their attention to peacetime needs. Factories that once built bombers now built commercial airliners. Shipyards that had launched warships began producing cargo vessels and passenger liners. Research laboratories that had developed radar, jet engines, and synthetic materials now drove advances in electronics, aviation, and medicine. The very technologies and production methods that had won the war helped fuel an era of unprecedented economic growth and prosperity in the post-war United States. The social fabric of the nation had been transformed as well. Millions of women who had entered the workforce during the war did not simply return to domestic life afterward. Many stayed in their jobs or pursued new careers, laying the groundwork for the women's rights movement that would gather strength in the decades to follow. African Americans, who had fought both fascism abroad and segregation at home, emerged from the war determined to claim the rights and freedoms they had helped defend, setting the stage for the civil rights movement. The GI Bill, which provided education and housing benefits to returning veterans, helped create a more educated and prosperous middle class. All of these changes had their roots, in part, in the experience of total national mobilization. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy of America's wartime industrial miracle was psychological. The war had demonstrated, in the most dramatic way imaginable, what a free society could achieve when it worked toward a common goal. The belief that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, a belief forged on the factory floors of Willow Run and the shipyards of California, became a central part of America's national identity. It shaped how Americans saw themselves and their country's role in the world. It underpinned the confidence with which the United States approached the Cold War, the space race, and countless other challenges in the second half of the 20th century. The same spirit that had built bombers and tanks would send astronauts to the moon and develop technologies that would transform the global economy. For Germany and other nations that had underestimated America before the war, the lesson was equally lasting. Military leaders and historians spent decades studying how a country with no standing army to speak of in 1939 had become the world's greatest military power by 1945. They examined the policies, incentives, and organizational structures that had allowed the United States to mobilize so quickly and effectively. Many of those lessons were incorporated into post-war military doctrines and economic policies around the world. West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s, was in many ways a deliberate attempt to replicate the dynamism and flexibility of the American model. Japan, too, rebuilt its shattered economy on principles of mass production, technological innovation, and export-oriented growth that bore more than a passing resemblance to America's wartime mobilization strategies. The transformation of warfare also extended into the realm of technology and science. During the war, America had invested heavily in research and development, not just for weapons, but for new materials, manufacturing processes, and logistical systems. This investment paid enormous dividends in the post-war era. The technologies developed during the war laid the foundation for entire industries: aviation, electronics, nuclear power, and eventually computing. The Manhattan Project, the most ambitious scientific undertaking of the war, not only produced the atomic bomb, but also ushered in the nuclear age, reshaping geopolitics for generations. Radar and jet propulsion transformed aviation. Synthetic rubber and plastics revolutionized manufacturing. The industrial infrastructure built to fight the war became the backbone of America's technological dominance in the second half of the 20th century. Even the concept of civilian participation in war evolved. The idea that ordinary citizens could play a decisive role in a global conflict, once considered implausible, became a central tenet of modern military strategy. Governments recognized that in any future conflict, the home front would be as important as the front lines. Civil defense programs, public education campaigns, and industrial readiness initiatives became standard features of Cold War planning. The phrase "arsenal of democracy," once a rallying cry in Roosevelt's speeches, became a permanent part of the American political lexicon, symbolizing the power of a free and united people. But beyond all the strategy, technology, and policy, the most enduring lesson of America's wartime mobilization was a simple one: the strength of a nation lies in its people. It was the ingenuity of the worker on the factory floor, the determination of the farmer in the field, the perseverance of the scientist in the laboratory, and the sacrifice of the family on the home front that ultimately decided the outcome of World War II. No amount of authoritarian control, no amount of propaganda, no amount of ideology could compete with a society that believed in itself and in the cause for which it fought. For the German officers who had once scoffed at the idea that a democracy could wage total war, this realization was both humbling and devastating. They had believed that power flowed from the top down, from leaders and armies, from commands and decrees. America had shown that true power flowed from the bottom up, from millions of individuals who, when united by purpose, could achieve feats that no dictator could order and no tyranny could compel. It was a lesson written not just in the ruins of Berlin, but in the bombers that filled the skies, the ships that crossed the oceans, and the tanks that rolled across the Rhine, all built by people who had once been dismissed as too soft, too selfish, too free. The world would never again underestimate the industrial and social potential of a democracy. The story of how ordinary Americans built the greatest war machine in history would become a blueprint for future generations, a reminder that freedom is not a weakness, that voluntary cooperation is not inefficiency, and that a society united in purpose can be stronger than any army ever assembled. In the decades following the Second World War, the echo of America's wartime industrial miracle continued to shape the global balance of power. The Cold War was, in many ways, the direct continuation of the lesson that Germany had learned too late, that the strength of a nation was measured not only by the size of its armies or the sophistication of its weapons, but by its ability to harness the talent, creativity, and labor of its people. The competition between the United States and the Soviet Union was not merely ideological or military, it was fundamentally industrial and technological. Each side sought to prove that its system, one built on free enterprise and voluntary cooperation, the other on state control and central planning, could mobilize resources more effectively and achieve greater feats. America entered this new era with an enormous advantage born directly from its wartime experience. It possessed a vast modern industrial base, a workforce skilled in advanced manufacturing, and a deep reservoir of scientific expertise. Factories that had once churned out tanks and bombers now built commercial airliners, automobiles, and consumer goods that would dominate global markets. The research institutions that had developed radar, synthetic materials, and nuclear power during the war became the incubators of new technologies, from jet propulsion to computing. And the logistical systems perfected during the war now formed the backbone of a global supply network that could project American power and influence anywhere on the planet. The same spirit of civilian participation that had driven wartime production also fueled America's ambitions in the post-war era. When President John F. Kennedy declared in 1961 that the United States would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade, he was channeling the same belief that had built the arsenal of democracy, the belief that a free people, united in purpose, could achieve the impossible. The Apollo program was, in many ways, a civilian mobilization effort reminiscent of World War II. Thousands of engineers, scientists, and technicians across the country contributed to its success. Entire industries pivoted to meet the technological challenges it posed. And just as ordinary Americans had once riveted bombers and assembled tanks, they now built rockets and designed spacecraft. The moon landing in 1969 was not just a triumph of science, it was a demonstration of what a mobilized democracy could achieve. This pattern repeated itself again and again throughout the Cold War. Whether it was building the interstate highway system, developing nuclear power, or launching communication satellites into orbit, the United States repeatedly turned to the same model that had worked so effectively during the war: large-scale mobilization of civilian talent and industry toward a shared national goal. And each time, the results reshaped the world. The Cold War itself was ultimately won not on the battlefield but through economic and technological superiority, a victory built on the same foundations that had produced the overwhelming tide of warplanes, ships, and tanks 2 decades earlier. The concept of total war, a society-wide effort to wage and sustain conflict, had been redefined by America's wartime experience. Before World War II, total war had often meant the militarization of society, compulsory service, state control of industry, and authoritarian direction of labor. After 1945, it increasingly meant something different: the ability of a free society to voluntarily organize itself for collective effort. This new model proved not only more efficient but also more adaptable. It allowed the United States to sustain decades of Cold War competition without resorting to the draconian measures that characterized authoritarian states. It also allowed for rapid surges of production and innovation when crises arose, whether building vast arsenals during the Korean War, developing new generations of nuclear weapons, or launching ambitious defense programs like the Strategic Defense Initiative. Other nations took note. European allies rebuilt their economies around similar principles, combining free market dynamism with state coordination in times of need. Japan, devastated by the war, adopted the American model of industrial organization and within a generation had transformed itself into one of the world's leading economic powers. Even the Soviet Union, despite its ideological opposition to capitalism, sought to emulate certain aspects of America's wartime mobilization, particularly its emphasis on scientific innovation and technological development. Yet none could fully replicate the unique combination of democracy, entrepreneurship, and civic engagement that had given the United States its edge. The legacy of America's wartime mobilization was felt not only in geopolitics, but also in the way societies understood themselves. The idea that civilians were not merely bystanders in war but active participants became deeply ingrained in public consciousness. Governments developed systems to harness civilian contributions in times of crisis, from civil defense networks to volunteer emergency services. Citizens, too, came to see themselves as stakeholders in national security, whether through paying taxes that funded defense spending, supporting veterans, or advocating for foreign policy decisions. The notion that every citizen is a soldier, once a totalitarian slogan, had been reimagined in democratic terms. Every citizen, through their labor, their votes, and their civic participation, played a role in the defense and destiny of their nation. The lessons of World War II also influenced how America approached conflicts in the second half of the 20th century. In Korea and Vietnam, the United States relied heavily on its industrial base to sustain extended military campaigns far from home. In the Persian Gulf War, it demonstrated how rapid mobilization of logistics, technology, and manufacturing could produce overwhelming force in a matter of months. Even in the 21st century, as warfare shifted from industrial-scale clashes to asymmetric conflicts and cyber battles, the principle remained unchanged. The strength of a nation still depended on its ability to marshal the ingenuity and effort of its people. Yet, for all the technological advances and geopolitical shifts that followed, the essence of what had happened between 1941 and 1945 never lost its power to inspire. It remained one of the most remarkable feats in human history, the story of how a nation of civilians, most of whom had never seen a battlefield, built the mightiest war machine the world had ever known. It was the story of how democracy, far from being a weakness, became the ultimate strategic advantage. And it was the story of how millions of ordinary people, united by a shared purpose, achieved what their enemies believed was impossible. For the German officers who had once ridiculed the idea that American, with their jazz music, their consumer culture, and their chaotic politics, could wage total war, this remained the most bitter lesson of all. They had believed that history was written by armies and dictators, but history, as it turned out, was written by welders and machinists, by mothers and students, by farmers and shopkeepers. It was written by a society that had learned how to turn freedom into strength. Even today, historians and military strategists continue to study America's wartime mobilization not just as a historical event, but as a case study in human potential. It remains a blueprint for how societies can respond to existential challenges, not only wars, but also economic crises, pandemics, and climate change. The same principles that built bombers and tanks, voluntary cooperation, decentralized innovation, and a shared sense of mission, are the same principles that can solve the great problems of the future. The story of America's citizen army, the millions who built warplanes in their spare time, who turned consumer factories into arsenals, who transformed a peaceful nation into the world's greatest power, is more than just a chapter in the history of World War II. It is a testament to what free people can achieve when they believe in a cause greater than themselves. It is a reminder that the strength of a nation is not measured in the number of its tanks or the range of its missiles, but in the determination, creativity, and unity of its people. And it is proof that, in the face of tyranny and oppression, the most powerful weapon of all is the will of ordinary citizens to stand together and fight, not just with guns and bombs, but with their hands, their hearts, and their hope. When historians look back on the Second World War, they often focus on the great battles: Stalingrad, Midway, Normandy, Berlin. They write about the famous generals, the bold strategies, the devastating weapons, and the monumental decisions that shaped the fate of nations. But beneath all of that, beneath the armies and navies, the politics and diplomacy, lies a deeper story, one that explains not just how the war was won, but why it was won. It is the story of a society that refused to be defined by its limitations, that turned its diversity into strength and its freedom into a weapon. It is the story of ordinary people who, faced with the greatest threat in human history, rose to meet it, not with fear, but with determination, and in doing so, changed the course of history forever. The most remarkable aspect of this story is that it was never inevitable. In 1939, the United States was far from a military superpower. Its army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than those of Portugal and Romania. Its navy, though formidable, was spread thin across 2 oceans. Its air force was small and underfunded. Most Americans were deeply isolationist, scarred by the memory of the First World War, and determined to avoid another foreign entanglement. Few could have imagined that within 6 years, this same country would not only defeat 2 of the most powerful military machines ever assembled, but emerge from the conflict as the preeminent global power. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous, and it was driven not by generals or politicians alone, but by millions of ordinary citizens. They were people like the housewives in Michigan who built bombers after putting their children to bed, the high school students in California who spent their summers riveting aircraft wings, the farmers in Iowa who worked their fields by day and assembled tank engines by night, the immigrants in New York who spoke broken English but mastered the complex machinery of industrial war, the scientists in New Mexico who harnessed the power of the atom, the factory foremen in Chicago who retooled entire production lines in a matter of weeks. Together they formed an army unlike any the world had ever seen, an army without uniforms, without rifles, without ranks, but one that was every bit as essential to victory as the soldiers who fought on the front lines. This civilian army did more than build weapons. It built the foundation of a new kind of warfare, one in which the strength of a nation was measured not just in military terms, but in economic, technological, and social terms as well. It showed that victory in a modern conflict depended on the ability to mobilize the full power of a society. its factories, its farms, its schools, its laboratories, its communities. It proved that a free people, motivated by a shared sense of purpose, could outproduce, out-innovate, and outlast even the most disciplined and militarized regimes. The German officers who witnessed this transformation struggled to comprehend it. Many of them went to their graves still trying to understand how a nation they had dismissed as decadent and disorganized could have overwhelmed them so completely. They could grasp the numbers, the tens of thousands of planes, the millions of vehicles, the oceans of supplies, but they could not grasp the spirit that had produced them. They could not understand how a society that valued individual liberty and personal choice could mobilize more completely than one that demanded obedience and sacrifice. They could not understand how workers who could quit their jobs at any time could still work harder and more efficiently than slave laborers who faced death for disobedience. They could not understand how a people who argued and disagreed and criticized their leaders could still unite around a common cause with more resolve than a nation drilled into submission. What they failed to see was that America's strength lay precisely in the things they had mocked as weaknesses. Its diversity was a source of creativity. Its freedom was a source of motivation. Its messy democracy was a source of resilience. The very qualities that authoritarian regimes dismissed as flaws were the ones that allowed the United States to adapt, innovate, and grow stronger as the war dragged on. When factories needed new designs, engineers were free to experiment. When production lines needed improvement, workers were encouraged to suggest changes. When shortages arose, businesses found new suppliers and developed new materials. When mistakes were made, they were corrected quickly, not hidden or denied out of fear. This flexibility, born of freedom, gave America a decisive edge over its enemies. The industrial miracle of World War II was also a triumph of imagination. Before the war, few could have imagined that civilian industries could be repurposed on such a scale. Few could have imagined that ordinary citizens could master the complexities of aircraft production or shipbuilding. Few could have imagined that a democracy could fight a total war without sacrificing its core values. And yet all of these things happened, not because they were planned from the top down, but because millions of people believed they could happen and set out to make them real. This spirit of possibility, this refusal to accept the limits imposed by tradition, ideology, or fear, was perhaps the most powerful weapon the United States possessed. The result was not just the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, but the creation of a new world order. The United States emerged from the war as the leader of a coalition of democracies, the architect of a new system of international institutions, and the guarantor of a global peace that, despite its imperfections, has lasted for nearly 8 decades. The industrial capacity that had once built tanks and bombers was now building the infrastructure of a new world. Highways and airports, universities and research laboratories, hospitals and housing developments. The spirit of mobilization that had once fueled the war effort now powered peacetime innovation and prosperity. And yet, the story did not end in 1945. The lessons of that era continue to resonate today. In times of crisis, whether military, economic, or environmental, the same principles that guided America's wartime mobilization remain as relevant as ever. The challenges may have changed, but the solution remains the same. Society united by a common purpose, harnessing the ingenuity and determination of its people, can overcome any obstacle. The same spirit that built bombers in the 1940s can build renewable energy systems in the 21st century. The same organizational genius that produced millions of vehicles for war can produce vaccines for global pandemics. The same belief that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things remains the foundation of democratic strength. This is the true legacy of America's wartime miracle. It is not just the story of how one nation built more tanks, planes, and ships than its enemies. It is the story of how free people, working together, can change the course of history. It is the story of how millions of hands, guided by hope and fueled by belief, can build a future no dictator can destroy. And it is the story of how the most powerful weapon in the world is not a bomb or a gun or a tank. It is the will of a people determined to defend their freedom and shape their destiny. For the German officers who watched this unfold, the realization came too late. They had believed that history was written by the powerful, by armies and empires, by tyrants and conquerors. What they learned as their cities burned and their armies collapsed was that history is written by the many, by the welders and machinists, the farmers and teachers, the mothers and daughters, the dreamers and builders. It is written by those who believe that they can make a difference, and who, when the moment comes, do. In the final reckoning, the story of America's civilian-built war machine is not just about industry, production, or logistics. It's about identity, about what a nation can become when its people are united by a purpose greater than themselves. It's about a democracy that the world dismissed as too soft to fight, too distracted to focus, too disorganized to win, and how that democracy transformed itself into the most formidable power in human history. It's about a society that, when faced with tyranny on an unprecedented scale, refused to shrink from the challenge and instead rose to meet it with every ounce of energy, creativity, and will it could muster. For the men of the Third Reich, this was a truth they never fully understood. They had believed that power came from control, that only a state that directed every aspect of life, that commanded its people like an army, could harness a nation's full potential. They believed that fear was stronger than freedom, that obedience was more reliable than choice, that coercion was more effective than cooperation. But they were wrong. The United States proved that a free society, far from being weak, could unleash a strength no dictatorship could ever match. Where authoritarian regimes relied on forced labor, America relied on willing hands. Where they demanded sacrifice through terror, America inspired it through belief. Where they imposed unity from above, America forged it from below. The factories that built the arsenal of democracy were not monuments to state power. They were temples of collective will. Each rivet driven, each wing assembled, each tank welded, was an act of defiance against tyranny. Every bomber that took flight, every ship that sailed, every truck that rolled toward the front was a declaration of what free people could accomplish when they refused to be intimidated. And behind every piece of machinery was a story of a mother who left her home to work in a plant, of a teenager who spent his summer learning to use a drill press, of a retiree who came out of retirement to serve one more time. It was the cumulative weight of those stories, millions of them, that crushed the Nazi dream of world domination. Even now, decades after the last shots of the Second World War were fired, the echoes of that civilian mobilization still shape the world. The technologies born from wartime research form the foundation of our modern lives, from jet travel to computing to nuclear energy. The political alliances forged in those years continue to define global security. The economic systems that emerged from America's wartime planning underpin the prosperity of much of the world, and the belief, the unshakable conviction, that free people can achieve the impossible remains at the heart of democratic societies everywhere. But perhaps the most profound legacy is not technological or political, it's human. It's the belief that history is not the exclusive domain of great men or powerful states. It is shaped by ordinary people, by their choices, their sacrifices, their willingness to rise to the moment. The men and women who built bombers in their spare time were not trained soldiers or professional strategists. They were teachers, mechanics, students, and farmers. They were mothers and fathers, sons and daughters. And yet, when the world needed them, they became the builders of victory. They proved that greatness is not a matter of position or power. It is a matter of purpose. Their legacy is a challenge to every generation that follows. It is a reminder that the freedoms we inherit are not guaranteed. They are built, defended, and sustained by people willing to work for them. It is a reminder that the most powerful response to tyranny is not fear, but unity. And it is a reminder that when free people decide to act, when they choose to stand together and commit their energy, their ingenuity, and their will, there is no force on earth that can stop them. The German officers who watched their empire collapse under the weight of America's industrial might could scarcely believe what they were seeing. They had been taught that history belonged to the strong, to the ruthless, to the disciplined. But as they looked up at skies darkened by bombers, as they saw convoys stretching from one horizon to the other, as they watched tanks roll across their homeland by the thousands, they were forced to confront a humbling truth. History belonged not to the few, but to the many. It belonged to the people who had built those machines, to the society that had produced them, and to the ideals that had inspired them. And so, in the final analysis, the victory of the United States and its allies in World War II was not just a triumph of arms. It was a triumph of belief, belief in freedom, belief in democracy, belief in the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. It was a triumph born not in the halls of government or the headquarters of generals, but on factory floors and assembly lines, in classrooms and kitchens, in small towns and big cities across a continent. It was a triumph forged by millions of hands that never fired a shot, yet built the weapons that would end the most destructive war in history. To German officers, war production meant slave labor, secret factories, and militarized industry. In America, it meant housewives, high school students, and farm boys clocking in after work. That opening line is more than a clever contrast. It is the essence of the story. It is the reason the United States was able to outproduce, outfight, and outlast its enemies. It is the reason democracy survived one of its greatest tests. And it is the reason the world we live in today, a world shaped by freedom rather than fascism, exists at all. The next time you see an old black and white photograph of workers standing proudly beside a bomber they built, or read about the millions of tanks and trucks that rolled off assembly lines during the war, remember this. Those people were not just building machines. They were building the future. They were building the conditions for victory. They were building a world in which tyranny would be defeated and liberty would endure. And they were doing it in their spare time. This is the ultimate legacy of America's wartime mobilization, the story of how ordinary people, united by an extraordinary purpose, became the most powerful force on earth. It is a story that belongs to all of us. It is a story worth remembering, and it is a story worth telling, again and again, because it reminds us of what we are capable of when we stand together, when we believe in something greater than ourselves, and when we decide with unwavering resolve that we will not be defeated.